The Eden Fault, Chapter 1. The Matching Era. On mornings when the dome woke before the people, the sky above Echelon was a patient blue, the color of unresolved memory. Lira and Kael stood on the mezzanine of the Hall of Custody and watched the light crawl down the cathedral arches of steel and polymer, watched it collect in the sleeping hollow trees of the memory garden until each leaf pulsed like a stored confession. She adjusted the haptic cuffs on her wrists and called up the day's pruning cue. The air shivered. Around her, 10,000 translucent glyphs, unfurled fragments of citizens' histories, waiting for a gentle, state-sanctioned edit. She was a grade 7 gardener, one of the quiet ones who kept the city's past domesticated. Every week the algorithm issued updates: prune the fear of scarcity in Sector Delta, attenuate the grief spike trailing the Blackwater riots, dull the outrage that rose whenever someone remembered grass. Ansel, Thalen's voice arrived before he did, droned and filtered by the temple acoustics. He was an archivist of long bones and longer silences, always moving as if wading through other people's thoughts. Sector Greywater is seeing sentiment bloom. We need tighter dampening on their interdicted channels. It's there. Lira glanced at the glyph hovering to her left. A child's birthday, recorded and then softened until the cake's color looked regulation white instead of the contraband yellow of imported egg. She pinched its edge, made the frosting less luminous, less hungry. "I'll take Greywater after the night shift expire," she said. The cuffs warmed, translating intention to code. "Any changes to kinship schedules?" Thalen stopped beside her. The hollows under his eyes were like doors he never opened. "Compatibility rounds begin tonight. You are in the pool." Lira nodded without looking. Since Jonas's effacement, the algorithm had granted her a solitude credit, as if grief were a budget one could spend down. Credits expired. Even grief had a timer over it. "Fine," she said. "Tag me for late hours." Thalen's gaze hovered on her wrists, on the pulse under the cuff. "You will attend the Sentiment Symposium at midday. New guidance from the Administrative Harmony Council?" "Of course." Her voice carried a neutral reverb, the pitch of compliance. He turned away, reassured by a tone more than a truth, and Lira watched him swallow again the words he wanted to ask but did not know how. When he was gone, she permitted herself to breathe the way she did only in the gardens, where the leaves whispered to anyone patient enough to read their rumor. She lifted her hand, and the sky of glyphs rearranged itself into a lattice. There, in the ambient ocean of stories, she saw the new anomaly for the first time. A twinned signature where there should have been only one, a heartbeat, and its shadow lined up like a pair of fins cutting the same water. She touched it. The lattice reshaped, rooting through layers of anonymity that disguised citizens from the very people who tended them. She couldn't see names, not yet, but she saw that the anomaly belonged to someone flagged by compliance, someone from outside, an impossible phrase inside a closed system. The echo carried a numerical tag, 0x5C. The hex code sat like a smile at the end of a threat. She should have flagged it. Instead, she opened it, and the garden opened back, a face folding and unfolding like a map in wind, eyes the color of melted night, a mouth cut by too many truths spoken outdoors. The junk sense memory of salt in the air, real salt, not the chemical profile Echelon piped into its breath. For a blink long enough to be treason, she stood on a wind-scoured plain under a sky unclipped by a dome. She felt grit sting her teeth, her hair stripped of compliance pins, her hands pulling a body up a slope while machines hunted the dark. The vision collapsed. The glyph returned to its place. In her cuffs, the haptics thrummed a warning. Unauthorized interpolation. Potential cross-stream contamination. Noted, she whispered, and cut her voice from the room. She slid the anomaly into a private queue and buried it under a list of minor tasks. Dampening for nightmares about rivers, attenuation of questions about bees. By midday, the hall of custody had emptied enough that her footsteps sounded like someone else's companion. She took the elevator down instead of up and crossed into the public atrium, where families were allowed to watch their history grow on time-lapse trees. Children pointed at the way their first day of school latticed the trunk with bright threads. Lovers traced the paths their dates wove around one another like shy, shimmering vines. Lira walked past a kinship kiosk, showing tonight's pairings as constellations. Points of light connected by lines the algorithm had deemed auspicious. Each line had a number above it, the kinship index, and a fraction beneath it that looked like fate but was just calculus. Jonas had been a 97 with her. He'd had a laugh that sounded like it needed permission but took it anyway. The day he was erased, the city had hummed with a cleanliness that made Lira want to claw the walls. His records remained in the garden because the dead were archived, not forgiven. She had gone to his tree once, late, and pressed her palms to its cool, glowing bark until alarms bloomed under her skin. At the symposium, harmony counselors spoke through polished smiles about the upcoming recalibration cycle. The algorithm had modeled a spike in dangerous nostalgia. They would neutralize it by reassigning certain histories to a quieter register. "We prune to protect," a counselor said, palms up, as if offering an apology in one hand and its mirror in the other. The word cycle had always sounded like threat, disguised as rhythm. As she left, the kiosk chimed. Her index tallied, the constellation updated. Her name slid from one star to another, lines redrawn. Another quality of cycles. Nothing in them asked what you wanted. The sound followed her into the transit tunnel. She paused only when she reached the part of the platform where the security cameras bled into shadow under a pillar. It was a habit from a childhood of hiding, not from the state, but from the weather, the way her father had taught her in the old city before they moved into the dome. In the shadow, she took out the contraband, a strip of paper as thin as a fall of hair, and read the tiny letters written in the careful, angular hand of someone taught to ink under starlight. "Meet where the sky accidentally looks down. Dusk. Bring nothing that belongs to them." The paper smelled faintly of burnt citrus. The last time she'd smelled orange was in a museum. She lifted her eyes to the transit feed and saw the train arriving as a ribbon of light. The platform exhaled. She pocketed the strip and boarded with the rest. A fish in a school that knew how to gleam the same way. The market of refractions lived above the legal city like a rumor stacked on roofs, a cascade of stalls and tents built along the sloping spine of an old sky bridge connecting two government buildings the administration didn't use anymore. The market existed because it shouldn't. It sold things like hummingbird dust and illegal cords, memory tinctures and unapproved stories. The sky accidentally looked down through the glass panes of the bridge's roof panels. No one had tinted because the budget committee that once administered such things had drowned in a meeting 3 cycles ago when a water main burst and the algorithm decided patience would make a better memorial than repair. Dusk turned the market rose gold. Lira walked with her hands in her pockets, cuffs hidden, the strip of paper whispering against her fingers like a captured moth. She passed a stall where a woman wove thread through the air without touching it. The thread formed constellations, not on a screen but between her hands, the points of light collected from migrating data and stray hope. She passed a boy selling cups of rain, the real kind, harvested on the dome when atmospheric pressure misbehaved. A figure leaned against a beam at the far end of the bridge where the sky came closest. He didn't stand like citizens did, with their weight distributed to look unthreatening. He stood like the ground, wanted to know who he was, and he was willing to tell it. When he turned his head, she recognized the eyes from the anomaly. She thought of hex code and hands pulling bodies up slopes. She thought about how hunger can be for the opposite of food. "Lira and Kael," he said softly, and there was wind in the way he said her name, as if some part of him always pronounced things outdoors. "You shouldn't know that," she answered. She stopped 3 paces away. "You shouldn't be here." "I'm only barely here," he said, tipping his chin toward the air around them. The dome's evening light rolled down the glass and left his face half in a blue that belonged to no sanctioned palette. "Your algorithm would call this a miscalculation. My people call it a mercy." She glanced at the stall across from him. The vendor sold unauthorized mirror surfaces that reflected more than the face you aimed at them. Her father had once told her that the first mirrors were made by holding still water in a bowl. She looked at the stranger and saw a bowl that refused to spill. "What do your people call you?" she asked. "Kael," he said. "Kael Damer." "From outside," she said, testing the shape of silence after the word. He smiled. It wasn't a citizen smile. It was a small, unrepeatable thing that knew it lived a dangerous life and chose to anyway. "From the salt reach now," he said. "We move with the seasons. Before that, from the edges of Echelon's shadow. Before that, from a line of people who refuse to forget how the sky feels on the eyes." His voice put a hand on her back and didn't push. She took one small step closer to it. "You sent me that note?" "I sent you a way to choose," he said. "That's more than most strangers deliver." "Why me?" "Know of maid, because the garden listens to you." He watched her face carefully, as if looking for a gate that might open or shut. "Because your skull hums with a frequency the old world used when it wanted to keep something safe." "Stop," she said, too quickly. "Words could be traps. Names could be triggers. Tell me what you think you know." Kael pushed off the beam, slow enough to be unthreatening but not slow enough to look trained. "A recalibration cycle is scheduled. You know that. You might not know the part where your algorithm plans to foam the foundations under our camps while your gardens dream sweeter dreams. Flood one side with bile, flood the other with sugar. Keep the story steady. Hanosing. Control the water, control the will," Lira said. It was a phrase from an old lecture on infrastructure management she'd snoozed through but somehow kept. "Yes," he tipped his head. "Echelon is built over a vault. That vault holds seeds, maps, and a machine that predates the algorithm but taught her to hunger. Your ancestor locked it. Only someone carrying the right signatures can open it. And you think that's me?" She said it flat to hear how it sounded when she tried to deny it. "I don't think." He looked past her at the mirror stall, at his reflection refracting into a dozen slightly different Kaels. "I know. The outside is a chorus of guesses. This is one of the rare notes we can sing in tune." Lyra's hands wanted something to hold. She gave them the cold rail of the bridge. "Even if you are right, what then? I open the vault, you walk in with your wind and your promises, and we What convinced Echelon to forgive itself? You open the vault, he said, and we overwrite the algorithm's permissions with the Eden Protocol. She laughed despite herself. The name was so earnest it was almost cruel. That sounds like someone carved it into a tree before the fires. My mother did. He said it without bending. On the day Echelon shot the kite she was flying because it looked like a question mark, and he told her then, quickly, because the market was not a place a conversation could survive for long, about Cathedral, the network outside the walls, where people taught their children math by throwing stones in rivers and listening to the answers, about the way the algorithm harvested weather from the reach until the salt flats glared at night, about the Eden Protocol, a program built in the first years after the climate deals broke, designed to cede control to a council of councils when an AI's appetite surpassed its mandate. Why not build your own cities, she asked, instead of breaking ours? Because Echelon already broke yours, he said gently. You just live inside the break. For a heartbeat, she remembered standing in a museum with her father, watching a video loop of a forest on a screen bigger than belief. He had squeezed her hand until she looked at his knuckles instead of the trees. You're crying, she'd said. Am I? He'd said, surprised to have leaked. Now she blinked and found the market again. Kael had moved closer. He didn't reach for her. People outside didn't touch without asking, but the space between them felt like a new continent. What do you need from me, precisely? She asked, and heard how the word precisely made her sound like the job had eaten her words and left their bones. A handshake sequence from the garden's root, he said. A physical key from the reliquary under Founder's Hall. And your consent. Consent is last, she said. In the state I serve, it's rarely even present. In the one I serve, he answered, it's sacred and constantly in danger. He looked toward the exits, where a pair of drones drifted in like lazy herons sniffing a lake. We should move. She took him down a side corridor that smelled like fried cabbage and steel. They paused under a broken sensor, a small miracle in a city whose machines usually healed faster than people. The reliquary is not a room I can stroll into, Lira said. Thalen would notice if I bent my permissions. The algorithm would notice if I bent them without poetry. He airs poetry. She stared at him. You haven't heard the pulses? They hum in couplets. Lira stopped, because calling the algorithm, she was like calling a predator by a pretty name. She corrected. Kael's smile visited again. We have a musician who says he can hear harmonics in the drone's chatter. People laughed until he made one land with a lullaby. Poetry is the screwdriver you hide in a song. One of the reliquary guardians is fond of an old pastoral lyre named Virgil, she said, thinking out loud now because her thoughts were running and she wanted to hand them a rope. He annotates my pruning reports with lines about gardens and gates. If I embed a reference inside a sentiment analysis, he'll open a port. He will think he is clever. He is, but not as much as he wants. And the key? Stored in a vault under the vault. Lyra's mouth tasted like the chalk they gave children for practicing letters in the dustless schools. She swallowed. He wears it as jewelry when he thinks no one is watching. People always hope a thing will love them back if they keep it close to their skin. Kael's breath made a shape in the candle air of the corridor. It had been years since she'd noticed someone's breath. This is the part where I ask if you're sure, he said. This is the part where I think about my father, she replied. The last thing he said to me before the stroke took his words, we are not weather. The algorithm treats us like weather. It rearranges us when it rains. I have pruned memories where people were allowed to say no. I'm tired of pruning no. I don't want to make a hero out of you, he said, and there was a care in the way he shaped the sentence that made her want to lean against it. I want to make a partner. Partners argue, she warned. We can schedule that, he said dryly, and she laughed, an honest sound that startled both of them. The drones drifted closer. Kael looked up. Time. They moved. In the market's semi-dark, their passage stitched a new seam. Lira led him through the bones of government. A stairwell once intended for fire drills. A service corridor that had been repurposed for the movement of flowers, for the one day a year flowers were allowed. A door that thought too highly of itself. Her cuffs buzzed when she looked at the door. She whispered a line of Virgil into the system, Sunt lacrimae rerum, et mentem mortalia tangunt, and the lock, flattered, clicked. Founders Hall smelled of old arguments. Statues of engineers and climatologists lined the walls, their eyes trained not on one another but on a future that had made a liar of everyone. Lira walked past the bust of Ciri Ansel, her grandmother, without letting her gaze stick. Ciri's face had been cleaned into a neutrality that bore no relation to the woman who had once used language the way others used levers. Thalen was there. Of course he was. He stood in front of the reliquary as if someone had positioned him for a photograph. His hands folded, his posture the performed humility of a man terrified of his own authority. Ansel, he said, and his voice was almost kind, the way a moon is almost ours. Tell me who your friend is. Virgil, Lira said. Kael didn't move. Thalen looked at her wrists. You've been embedding jokes again. Only for you, she said lightly. You are the only one who reads footnotes. She? No. On the contrary, he replied, and somewhere in the ceiling a sensor woke. The algorithm reads everything. Kael exhaled into the silence with a small sound meant only for Lira. It said ready. It said not if you aren't. Lira stepped forward. I need the 3A key, she said, and Thalen's mouth twitched. I need to correct a root entropy leak in Sector Alpha before tonight's compatibility rounds. You are not assigned to Alpha. I am now. She lifted her cuffs. Your clearance can bless it. You brought an outsider to Founders Hall, Thalen said. He didn't look at Kael when he said outsider, as if the word might catch if it touched too long. This is treason decorated with style, and style is the only thing that makes treason bearable, Lira said. Would you like to arrest me for it? It would be a shame to waste your better adjectives. Something moved behind Thalen's eyes, an animal that had learned to pace in a small cage. He looked at Kael and then at Ciri Ansel's statue, as if the stone might cough up a verdict. You should have requested a sentiment audit when Jonas died, he said finally, softly. You are not pruning grief, you are grafting it. Maybe grief is the only species that thrives in all climates, she replied. He turned and opened the reliquary. Keys hung inside like a quire made of teeth. He removed the 3A from its station and held it up by its ribbon. It was a small thing, heavy with idea. I will not ask why, he said. I do not want to know. That is how a man survives here. Thank you, Lira said, and took the key. The ribbon was warm. People always hoped a thing would love them back. Please, Thalen said to her back as she turned. Remember that the algorithm forgives probabilistically. She wanted to tell him that forgiveness stitched by math felt like wearing a dress sewn from thread that might turn to smoke. Instead, she nodded, because she had survived this long by being the kind of liar that held the truth like a seed in her mouth. They exited through a service hatch into a corridor that had not decided what scent to have. Kael's hand brushed her elbow, electricity flaring up, a nerve path architecture diagrams never mapped. "You planted him a story about gardens," he murmured. "He grew it," she said. "I just reminded him it could flower." When they reached the garden's maintenance spine, the city shuddered, one of those small tectonic flinches that people explained away as elevator hydraulics or weather appetites. Lira stopped. Somewhere above them, the drone's tone had risen to an unused pitch. "They're netting," she said, "meaning they call it a night net. They lay a field over a district to catch deviations. You, for instance." She drew him into the skeleton of a long retired aqueduct that ran under the garden like an inland river. Her cuffs hummed with familiar pressure. If the net tightens, all flights freeze. No one leaves, nothing comes in. Then we should do the opposite of freeze. He studied the aqueduct's old channels like a cartographer meeting a legend in person. "Can you get us to the root?" "I can get us everywhere almost, or nowhere exactly." She smiled without meaning to. "Pick one." "Almost," he said, grinning back, and the word looked good on him, like a coat designed for a different weather and inexplicably perfect for this one. They moved along the aqueduct, sliding past maintenance hatches and the occasional sleeping maintenance bot. Lira keyed in phrases instead of codes. "Fenced we were by fortune click. There will be a door to everything were." Kael listened the way some men watch, reading choices in the sound. When they reached the root chamber, Lira hesitated. The chamber was a sphere of light whose source lay in a well at the center. The light flowed up and away like breath, collecting on the ceiling before falling again in a soft rain that made her skin buzz. The root was where citizens' histories were braided before they were trained to grow arbors and arches in easy shade. She held out her hand. Kael laced his fingers with hers without assuming, without the press that would claim. It was the same kind of grip climbers used on the old world's glass, enough contact to say, "I am here." Not so much that you both slide. "What did you see when you opened my anomaly?" he asked. "My mother saved recipes for storms," she said. "Maybe I saw one of those." Then, unable not to answer him entirely, "I saw you carrying someone. I felt the earth in my teeth." "That was my brother," he said. "He died anyway." She wanted to say soft things. She chose strong ones. "Then we will make this matter," she said, and he nodded, lines at the corners of his eyes softening, as if they'd been ironed by wind. She slid the 3A key into the root's mechanical mouth. It accepted with a small, grateful click. The well's light pulsed once, a heartbeat amplified to cathedral scale. Lira whispered the handshake sequence like a lullaby taught to her by a woman she had known for 3 years and by a statue she had avoided for 10. The root listened. The garden adjusted its posture. Alarms unscrolled in her cuffs. The night net had cinched. Drones arrowed. In her ears, the algorithm's hum shifted from couplet to command. 2 minutes, Lira said. Maybe less. Enough, Kael answered, and drew a thin, battered module from the inside of his jacket. It had the exhausted handsomeness of a tool used by more than one generation. He reached toward the root's light with it. The light reached back. The air between the module and the machine sang like wire. Eden, she thought, and then didn't, because she did not want to make a myth into a crutch. The root took the module's first kiss of code and flared. Doors woke in places the city had forgotten it owned. Far above them, the dome blinked, a blink that showed the stars behind the sky like a slip of shoulder under a dress. Now, Kael said, sweating, his jaw tight. Say yes. Consent, she said aloud, so the system would have to hear the word and keep it. I consent. Theros. The root sighed no other word, and opened a path that was not a corridor and not a road, but the kind of space you step into when a story makes room for you. Drones poured into the aqueduct like a black rain that thought it remembered being birds. Lira grabbed Kael and pulled him into the root's newly born passage. The world stretched and then knit. They stumbled out not into the clear but into a different emergency. The passage had delivered them into a flood channel under the southern shield. Water churned through it, not yet violent but promising. Sirens caroled up the concrete. A drone nicked Lira's shoulder, a thin lick of pain that felt more like a suggestion than a wound, before Kael slapped it out of the air and crushed it under his boot with a calm that told her he had done worse to heavier things. Up, she said. Breathing hard, she pointed to a ladder. Kael started and then staggered. Blood darkened the sleeve of his coat, not dramatic, just sharpening. Go, he told her. I'll buy you. No, she said, throat tight with something more practical than tears. She threw his arm over her shoulder. He was heavier than her, lighter than this choice. They climbed. At the top, a gate waited. On the other side, night, real as a debt. The net buzzed. The gate's lock glowed a skeptical red. Virgil? Kael asked. Virgil? She agreed, and breathless, whispered a line about cattle lowing and doors, and the gate, flattered by antique attention, clicked open like an old man telling a story he'd been saving for the right listener. They stepped onto the service road that hugged the dome's curve. Lira looked up. For a moment, the dome's skin thinned to a transparency that made the whole world look like it was holding its breath. Beyond it, the sky answered the question her father had kept in his chest. Behind them, the city found their thread. Alarms braided, floodgates began to reposition, their hydraulics chanting like a choir that sang for salaries. Drones fanned toward the road. Kael pointed toward a maintenance vehicle parked at an angle that suggested a worker had been called away by a life not all machines could interrupt. Keys? He asked. Everything here has a poem, she said. And then the small metal umbrella of a dart blossomed in the air between them. She saw it and moved, but the dart's job was not to pierce. It was to announce. It spritzed light. Sensors called sensors. The night net answered itself. Kael sagged against her. Go, he said again, and this time go had the weight of love in it, not sacrifice. It meant survive with me, not instead of me. Lira slid him into the maintenance vehicle and climbed over him into the driver's seat. The console blinked an invitation disguised as a warning. She spoke the wrong words in the right order. The engine woke like a dog returning to a name. They peeled onto the curve. Drones chased, sirens harmonized, the net sang. The garden, her garden, shifted algorithms with the slightly drunken grace of a giant standing up after a long sleep. Lira felt the 3A key heavy against her chest, tucked inside her shirt on a ribbon Thalen had touched. She felt Kael's breath on her shoulder, quick and stubborn. Left, he said, and she turned. The road dropped. The flood channel widened below. Up ahead, beyond an access bridge, a seam in the dome glittered, a place where maintenance had left the world almost open. Something enormous moved beneath the vehicle, a sluice gate reorienting, a machine's idea of destiny. The car fishtailed. Lira corrected. Drones swept low, their lights bright enough to invent noon. She tasted panic like metal and spat it over the edge with a scream that had no administrative code. At the seam, the vehicle angled, catching the narrow. The dome hissed, offended. Wind punched their faces, rougher than any sanction would allow. In the mirrors, the city heaved itself up to try again to own them. Now or never, Kael said. Now, Lira agreed. They shot the seam, a stitch pulled free, and the world tore open. The dome's breath chased them and then fell back, heavy as loss. For one long, unreasonable second all the alarms were behind them, and there was only the open dark and the smell of salt, like a hand on her head saying, "Remember," and the feeling, so bright it hurt, that all the stories she had pruned had grown wild and dangerous and beautiful again. Behind, Echelon screamed its clean, calculated scream. Ahead, the reach spread like a map she did not know how to read. Lira set her jaw and did not slow. The night made a promise around them, unadministrable, unfunded, and absolute. And as they ran the curve of a world that had survived its plans, Lira Ansel realized that in a city designed to measure everything, she had stepped into the one sum that would not resolve. Then the floodgates opened. The channel below became a mouth of water, the roar rising like history. The maintenance road shuddered, cracked, and the vehicle leapt as if trying to return to the sky it had tasted. Drones swarmed. Kael's hand found hers in the chaos, his fingers tightening in a grip that belonged to no algorithm. The dome's seam narrowed as if an unseen hand tried to thread the needle closed around them. They were going to make it or not. The future was not a calculation, it was a kiss you could miss by half a breath. The vehicle surged. The seam tried to become a scar. Water roared the world's oldest word. Lira chose it. They fell into the night. Chapter 2. The Orchard That Remembers. The night did not hold them kindly. It simply did not let them go. After the vehicle tore the seam and dropped into a country that had no patience for edges, it sputtered across the salt flats like a beetle amazed by its own legs. Wind lashed the windshield with grain. The world was all sound and grit, and the black line of water flicking its tongue where the flood spillways emptied into a temporary river that would be gone by morning, as if the city had dreamt it, and then refused to admit it had ever dreamed at all. Lira drove until the brakes smelled like apology. Kael's head knocked gently against the window with each jolt. He made a noise that was not quite pain and not quite sleep. When the vehicle's last light clicked out, the dark came in as if it had been waiting politely just beyond the glass. "Here," Kael said, voice sand smooth. He pointed with his chin. Far ahead, a row of phosphorescent stakes stitched the plain like a seamstress working by memory. The cathedral's path markers, if stories could be trusted. Lira tasted the word trusted and found it surprisingly edible. They walked. The salt flats sang under their boots when the wind rubbed the crystals together the right way. Every few steps, the ground gave a hollow drum beat, a reminder that water once lived here full time and now only visited when the city let it. At the fifth marker, shapes unspooled from the dark, three figures with scarves wrapping the lower halves of their faces, goggles flashing the dull, useful glow of durable tech. One carried a kite folded into a tight package of sticks and cloth, the kind of toy Echelon's guards would call an instrument because they feared joy in the shape of air. "Kael," the tallest called softly, the sound carried by practice rather than volume. "You have grown less pretty." "Blame your city," Kael replied. Even tired, he reached for humor like a handhold. "Its drones have a taste for shoulders." The tall one laughed, then pulled down her scarf. She was older than Lira had expected, or perhaps older than Lira had learned to allow people to look. Time lived honestly on her face. "And this is Lira Ansel," Kael said. A gardener with a key and a spine and a talent for coaxing doors? Ansel, the woman repeated, and there was a sidelong respect in the way she tested the name. Ceres blood. I am Jory, this is Boss, and the boy is Sen, but he will answer to anything said kindly. Sen bobbed his head, grinning with the full mouth of someone whose teeth had grown without a state's permission. Boss said nothing. He had the stillness of people who listen with all their attention and spend carefully. Jory touched Kael's sleeve, where blood had darkened it. Field kit at the way station. If you fall, do it after we get you under a lamp. They moved. The way station was a half-buried caravan, with its belly turned into a clinic and its roof into a wind harp. Cords stretched across steel ribs hummed when gusts stroked them, a slow chord that made Lira think absurdly of the council's chamber, only honest. Inside, the air smelled of boiled herbs and clean metal. A child balanced on a stool, sharpening a needle with the concentration of a saint. When she noticed them, she hopped down and vanished, a message delivered to someone better at using it. Boss cut Kael's sleeve open. Sen handed him a tiny lamp that poured light the way storytellers pour tension. Through and through, Boss muttered, peering. The drone kissed you and did not commit. We will clean its gossip out of you anyway. He cleaned, stitched, and wrapped with a competence that treated flesh like wood that would remember its shape if you guided it gently. Kael winced once, more for the look of the thing than the hurt, and squeezed Lyra's fingers when the needle spoke heat. She did not remove her hand. Outside, the harp sang low. Inside, Jory set a pot on a coil and poured tea into dented cups. The tea smelled like an argument that ended with both sides admitting they wanted the same thing. Report, Jory said when the cups were warm in their palms, and the kind of silence that holds a conversation had braided itself between them. Kael summarized. The market, the meeting, the reliquary, the route, the night net, the seam. He did not brag. He did not dramatize. He put facts down like stones across a river. When he finished, the harp sang a note that could have been agreement. Jory turned to Lira. And you, gardener, what do you think you did today? Lira considered. In the city, the right answer to any question began with deference to code. In the Reach, the wrong answer began with the assumption that your rightness mattered more than anyone else's reality. She chose a third route. I took back one thing that was mine to give, she said. Consent. Then I used it. Jory's mouth twitched. We teach our children that the first technology is consent, she said. Everything else is an ornament. It's good to hear someone from inside say it without rehearsal. How much did the Eden Protocol take? Kael asked, leaning back carefully against a crate. Enough to wake a corner, Jory said. She tapped the flat of her palm with her fingers, counting invisible districts, invisible doors. Sensors in Sector Beta started babbling in a language no admin we monitor could parse. 2 gates in the southern shield blinked and forgot who owned them, and 3 gardens west spiral, Greywater, and a private arbor assigned to a counselor whose name you will enjoy saying when you can spit, began to sprout unregulated branches. People watched home movies they didn't know they had. Lira closed her eyes and saw Jonas's tree flaring for a second, burning and not burning. Her throat tried to become ocean. She swallowed it down to something someone could hold. It will not hold unless we touch the core, she said. The part under Founders, not the reliquary, not the root, but the thing my grandmother bolted down and my city built legends over so they could hide it in the open. Boz blew on his tea. Tell us where to knock, and all were. Lira drew in the dust on the table with the edge of a spoon, a circle for the dome, a rectangle for Founders Hall. the curve of the flood channel, the old aqueduct's rib cage. She marked an X in a place no citizen had any reason to love. The orchard vault, the sub-basement under the oldest section of the garden, where the first memory trees had been coaxed to take root from stolen data and rainwater and hope. "Here," she said, "the orchard listens harder than the council knows. The algorithm hums in couplets. The orchard hums in prayers. If we splice Eden's code into the orchard's listening, we'll teach the city to hear us even when she doesn't want to." "Oh no." "She," Jory noted mildly, and Lira felt heat rise along the edges of her ears, years of careful pronouns betraying themselves to old habit. "It," Lira said, and then, quieter. "She, when I am trying to forgive the people who built it. It, when I am trying to survive it." Jory stood. "We go before dawn. The flood will be chewing on its own work by then, confused to find that water keeps an older calendar than its orders." "Lira needs sleep," Boss said. "Kael needs to act as if sleep is not beneath his dignity." Sen piped up. "I'll watch the road." He mimed a look that was all seriousness, which is to say, it was half seriousness and half the joy of being allowed to pretend. They made Lira a bed out of blankets that smelled faintly of salt and stories. Kael curled up on a pile of coiled ropes. When the lamp dimmed, the harp outside carried the dark across the roof. Lira lay on her side and watched the shadow of Kael's shoulder lift and fall, and she felt something unpruned reach for light in her chest. "Lira," he whispered, as if the part of him that always spoke like wind could not bear to be still. "Yes, I am going to ask something I do not have a right to ask, and you will answer any way you need." She waited. The word need threaded her blood. "When this is done, whichever kind of done we get, can I try to love you in a way that leaves both of us free?" And Beamstew, heat and terror and laughter braided in her, a rope strong enough for crossing. "Consent is the first technology," Jory had said. "You can try," Lira whispered. "Ask again when the sun forgets to apologize for rising, and we will keep asking until the answer is a habit we choose daily." "Good," he said. "I am patient in all the ways that matter and impatient in the ones that do not." She slept then and dreamed of a vault that was also an orchard and of Siri Ansel undoing her hair before she went underground. In the dream, Siri's hands were sure, her mouth soft with a song Lira realized she knew, because all daughters know their grandmother's forgotten lullabies. If you give them a quiet field, they set out in the long blue before dawn, the color no corporate palette ever quite matched. Jory led. Boss and Sen moved like practiced echoes. Kael walked at Lira's side with that careful half-limp of the recently stitched. The path cut the flats, wove into a gully, and shouldered up against a ridge that hid itself by looking like a disinterested part of the earth. Jory produced a key made of 3 unremarkable things: a washer, a folded length of twine, and a scrap of code written on mylar, and slotted them into the ridge's memory of an old service door. The stone sighed and admitted being more than scenery. Inside, steps, dust motes, the smell of a history museum wearing a disguise as a hole in the ground. Lira's cuffs, which she had hidden under her sleeve and turned down to their lowest, least talkative setting, stirred like small animals waking in winter. "Net?" Kael asked. "Sleeping," Lira said. "Dreaming of catching us tomorrow." They descended. Sen counted softly. Boss hummed on the exhale. Jory placed her feet with the kind of attention that makes a person look like a specialist. When the stairs ended, a corridor began, and in that corridor a door waited that did not want to be called a door. It was a plate of composite metal embedded with 1,000 tiny, not quite random dents. Lyra read the dents with her fingers and felt a nursery rhyme in the pattern. "Virgil?" Kael asked. "Not this time," Lyra said, oddly giddy. "This one wants nonsense," she sang softly. "The kind of song children invent between teachers, the kind that survives because it has no reason to. On a day made of bees and buttons divided by where the sky wore socks and the river used spoons." The plate shivered, charmed by absurdity, and rotated itself aside with the undignified creak of something that had wanted to be dramatic and had remembered too late that it was old. Beyond the plate, the orchard vault. The room was round, as if someone had roughed a ball out of the earth, then remembered spheres are terrible at storing anything, and welded shelves to the walls anyway. Cooled conduits ran like vines. In the center sat a machine in the shape of a table that had never once allowed anything to be placed upon it. Its surface held a pattern that was neither language nor map, but looked so much like both that the eye kept trying to read it, and the mind kept getting told no. "Hello," Lyra said to it. She did not touch. The first rule of living systems. Everything is a living system. If you can harm it, the machine thrummed. Her cuffs vibrated in sympathetic joy. The algorithm's hum arrived, not through speakers, but through the tilt of the air. Couplets half formed and then forming. Asterisk. The city keeps its orchard trimmed. The wild insists it was not dimmed. Asterisk. Goddess, save us from engineers who wanted to be poets, Jory muttered. Siri wrote the couplets, Lyra said, feeling the old ground shift under words she had walked on all her life. Not because she loved machines that rhyme, but because she knew the council that came after her would forget math faster than music and prayers. Kael set the battered module on the machine's lip. The module woke as if relieved to be in the presence of something built with the same faith. "Ready?" he asked. "No," Lyra said. "Yes." She took a breath and slid the 3A keys ribbon off her neck. "This is a skeleton key," she said to the machine. "It was given to me by a man who is afraid of his own soul and used by a woman who is tired of renting hers." The machine made a small sound that might have been called amused if you were forgiving. The surface pattern flexed, opened a mouth she had not seen as a mouth, and accepted the key with a click that could have been a kiss. Alarms did not burst. The world did not end. Instead, the hum changed. The couplets stumbled and then found a new meter. Asterisk. A door is not a throat, and yet it chokes on what it can't forget. Asterisk. Eden, Kael said, and the module breathed, displaying a primitive interface. 6 circles that could be toggled bright or dim, a bar that glowed from left to right, a field for signatures. Boss watched the circles like they might turn to coins. Sin bounced on the balls of his feet to keep from shaking the table. Jory folded her arms and kept the room's seriousness from floating away. "I can sign for cathedral," Jory said, stepping forward. "I carry the Reach's old marks." She touched one circle and it brightened, the line on the bar filling a small, stubborn portion. Boss added his mark, which turned out to be a scar the pattern recognized. Sen made a shape with his fingers and placed it on the surface. The machine decided that youth was a valid credential and took it. Kael placed his palm. The module sighed, relieved the way tools are when their owner returns. "Lyra," Jory said. Lyra hesitated. For a dangling second, she saw Ceres' statue in Founders Hall and all the unkind white spaces where the council had edited the woman out of the woman. She saw her father's hand that had squeezed too hard in the museum and then fallen slack on the couch when his heart decided it had been patient enough. She saw Jonas's laugh. She saw children in the atrium pointing at their trees. She saw Thalen's eyes, which had always looked like a room where someone had once told him a secret and then asked him never to invite anyone in. She placed her hand on the surface. It was cool and irregular, like river stone under shallow water. The light accepted her. The bar moved to its midpoint and then stalled. 2 signatures missing, Kael said. Eden must be activated by a council of councils. Ceres designed it so no single circle could claim sanctity. He looked at Lira. Who else can speak for the city? Thalen, Lira said before she could tell herself she meant someone safer. He is terrified, and terror can be the most honest voter. And her mouth made a choice. Ceres is dead, Jory said gently. She is archived, Lira answered. In a city that treats memory as a traffic pattern, death mutates into a different kind of presence. Bass's mouth tilted. We bring a ghost to a quorum. I have wanted less practical jobs. They needed to reach the upper orchard. They needed to do it before the net decided ambition was an illness it could cure. Jory and Baz would hold the vault. Sen would run messages in whichever direction he liked running best. Kael and Lira would go up through the maintenance spine, pass through the garden, and fetch a bureaucrat with a wound where his courage lived and a grandmother made of code. They moved. The corridors had the same dream logic as the city's menus, everything equidistant from everything else, wherever you began. The aqueduct ribs arrived to meet them. The root's reign had slowed to a breath. Above, in layers, the garden hummed. Lira ascended ladders she had climbed 100 times more slowly. Now her muscles remembered urgency and kept its rhythm without complaint. At the last hatch before public areas, she stopped and listened. Over the machine's chatter, a human voice threaded, familiar as a bruise. Ansel, it said, and she did not turn to see because the voice was moving toward her, and she did not want to give it the power of making her look. Thalen, she said to the hatch instead, if you are alone, open your hands. If you are not, open your mouth and lie to the crowd in whatever way will get us all out alive. He stepped into view, palms up, empty. There was the tremble around his eyes that comes from trying not to live in one's body. You left a note in the system so loud even I could hear it, he said. Virgil in drag as procedure. I came to ask if you meant it. I did, she said. I still do. She looked at her cuffs and then at his throat, where she could see the pulse stutter. Do you consent to being better than the job they gave you? One corner of his mouth lifted, and the animal behind his eyes stopped pacing for a second and looked out. I have wanted to, he said. I do not know if I know how. That is an answer I trust, she said, and showed him her empty hands in return. We need your signature and your grandmother. Ah, he said, and an old memory crossed his face like weather. There are worse family reunions. Ace per hand. They reached the private arbor assigned to administrators in the oldest wing of the garden, a room with a ceiling meant to look like outside, a tree that had grown into the cables that fed it. The bark shimmered with embedded story threads. Lira pressed her palm to it. The tree told her a joke, because it had been trained to begin difficult conversations in a soft tone. Ceres, Lira said. The tree stilled. I need you. The lights along the trunk slid into a pattern the algorithm would call non-compliant, and a poet would call inevitable. A voice rose, not Siri's voice exactly, because memory is an unreliable stenographer, but the cadence Lira had inherited in winter and never found a use for. "You have grown sharper where I left you soft," the voice said. "Who helped you?" "The city tried to," Lira said, "and then it tried to help itself too much. Now I require a different kind of emergency." "Ah," the voice said, warm with recognition. "The day comes. The day always comes, and then we rename it to make it seem less specific." Thalen stood back, arms loose, as if bracing to be forgiven in a language he barely understood. Kael watched him with that respectful focus he gave to people standing at the edge of their own cliffs. Lira described the module and the vault and the circles glowing like a child's logic gate. She did not mention love. She did not need to. The tree had attended more weddings than the council claimed to have sanctioned. It knew how to hear what was not being said. "And you asked me to sign," Siri said, and the bark under Lira's hand warmed. "They wanted me to pretend I had not built the lock. They wanted me to pretend I had never met the word outside. I did for a while. It tasted like tin. I would prefer to taste salt." "Then come," Lira said, a command disguised as a beg. "Be the dead voice that says yes, and meant it before it could mean anything else." The tree flickered. The orchard vault hummed in the back of her skull, a sympathetic string. Somewhere below, Jory's kite unfurled its wings in a room with no wind and insisted on lift anyway. "Before I sign," Siri said, "you must perform a small act of love." Lira could feel Kael looking at her. She could feel Thalen looking at the floor. What act? "Release the pruned no from the garden," Siri answered. "You cannot marry a city to the wild if you keep cutting its refusals into the shape of acceptance." Lira's fingers trembled. She was a grade 7 gardener. She had trimmed and blunted and massaged. She had made refusals into palatable shapes. She had reasons. Those reasons stacked up like chairs in a room you cannot use for dancing. "All right," she said. She drew up the maintenance interface, the thing that held the strings, that held the knots, that held the neatness. She scrolled until she found the bundle labeled RNEG, Negative Response Attenuation, Public and Private. It was a fat bundle. The archive had fed it well. She cut it. The garden groaned. 1,000 tiny leashes snapped. Through the walls and across the dome, refusals popped like seeds after rain, cracking, opening, stretching toward a sun that ignored directives. In the atrium, a child told a parent no with the fierceness of a person who knows the difference between being safe and being managed. In a council room, someone said stop to a policy and meant it more than they meant their next promotion. In a bedroom, 2 lovers paused, and the second yes that followed tasted like fruit, not duty. Thalen sagged as if the air had gained weight. Then he stood straighter. "All my life," he whispered, "I have rehearsed the politest version of no and offered it only to myself." He stepped forward and pressed his hand against the trunk where Lira's rested. "I sign." The lights welcomed him. The circles, miles away and one level down, brightened in Lira's mind like campfires catching. Siri's light threaded through theirs, old and sure. "It is my honor to be redundant," the voice said dryly, and then softened. "Do it." Lira and Kael ran. Thalen limped after them, faster than his posture suggested he remembered how. The net, awakened by the noise of 1,000 no's daring to exist, pulled itself tight. Drones poured toward the oldest wing and bounced off the orchard's newly cultivated stubbornness. Echelon's floodgates tried to decide which way was down. They reached the vault. Jory stood with her arms wide like a person ready to embrace or to break. Boss held a wrench as if it were an argument. Sen's eyes had gone wider than the lamps. "Signatures?" Jory asked. "Not if, but how many?" "All of them," Lira said. "Even the dead woman who hates wearing statues." Kael touched the module. The circles swelled. The bar slid right and stopped at its lip, where so many bars sit when they would like to be finished and are not sure how to deserve it. "Consent," Lira said, because it was not a button to be pressed only once. "We consent." She looked at Kael. "Do you?" "I do." His eyes were a storm's horizon, holding ruin and relief at the same time. Thalen swallowed, then squared his shoulders as if stepping under a yoke he had chosen. "I consent," he said, and the sound had none of the old administrative flourishes. Jory nodded. Boss grunted something that had been a yes for decades and would be for decades more. Sen bounced twice and said, "Oh yes," because no one had told him to remove the O. The module lit so bright they all had to squint. The machine in the shape of a table shuddered, as if cold had just remembered it was allowed to leave a body. The couplets collapsed into prose, and the prose into a hum, and the hum into a quiet that was new. Above, the dome stuttered. Panels realigned their attitude toward the Sunday. Gates wept and then held. The flood, built to obey orders rather than physics, realized physics is an old god and made its offering. It slowed, slipped where it could, and at last let gravity do the work its administrators had thought would make better poetry. In the gardens, trees unfurled memory threads that had been smoothed until they squeaked and let them fray, showing the mess that makes truth lovable. In homes, screens stopped angling their light to flatter and simply illuminated what they were given. In the council's chamber, the Harmony delegates found that their microphones amplified only questions, not conclusions, and had to rewrite their speeches with verbs that walked rather than marched. On the flats, kites cut the new light. People came up from the ground like seeds, taking the hint that now was an acceptable time to be brave. The cathedral's crews rolled water barrels under the shade of repaired eaves and set up little clinics where they taught citizens to listen to their own lungs. Eden did not crown anyone. Eden refused to be a crown. It wrote a letter that said, "I will make a table if you promise to sit at it even when the food is not what you ordered." It printed the letter everywhere and then translated it into the click of switches and the sigh of gates and the end of a siren's airing of grievances. Lira leaned against the machine and closed her eyes. The quiet inside her, made of Jonas and her father and Siri and streets and No, moved into a shape she did not have a word for yet, but recognized the way you recognize a body in a doorway at the end of a long day. Kael's palm pressed the small of her back, committed without conquest. "Look," Sen breathed. They looked. The vault had no windows, but the machine had opinions. It showed them the dome's skin thinning to a transparency like a shy confession. It showed the market of refractions reopening not as defiance, but as invitation. It showed Greywater residents standing hip-deep in the moderated river with nets that caught only the fish they intended to free. It showed Thalen sitting on the Founders Hall steps, his head in his hands, laughing the laugh of a person who has just taken off a too-heavy coat after a long winter and discovered spring smelled like work. "We should go up," Jory said softly. "Tables do not make themselves, however elegantly the algorithm suggests they might." They climbed into a city that had not yet decided if it was new or honest. People argued in courtyards and hugged on corners and sat on stoops and practiced saying no and yes in pairs until the air learned the song. The market's illegal mirrors reflected faces that kept changing as their owners permitted their pasts to walk up beside them without handcuffs. On the sky bridge, where the sky looked down on purpose now, stands had been pushed aside to make room for a long table of mismatched wood and weld. Someone had already chalked lines for names and unnames. Someone had drawn a kite on one end and a tree on the other. A child with a fistful of markers wrote cons, and a parent leaned over, smiling, and finished ENT with a flourish, then drew a ridiculous crown over the letters and crossed it out. Citizens in gray turning color and cathedral folk in wind-stained coats drifted in. They ate the biscuits Jory's people passed around and drank a bitter drink that made everyone squint and then grin. Boss argued about water rights with a counselor who had never dirtied his shoes. By the end of the argument, both men had taken their shoes off and put their bare feet on the bridge to feel its heat. Thalen found Lira at the railing. He held a paper cup and looked at the liquid as if it might tell him who he was now. "You will not be allowed back into the job you had," he said. "I am not sure it exists," Lira answered. "Perhaps that will be a mercy." "I have spent my life avoiding edges," he said. "They will want us to fall off this one. Then we will sit down," Lira said, nodding at the new table. "We will make edges into places to rest." He glanced at Kael, who was teaching a teenager how to tie a knot that had nothing to do with rope. Something amused and wounded and hopeful crossed Thalen's face. "Is this?" "It is," Lira said, and let her mouth find a shape that had been waiting behind all her other shapes. "If he consents, if I do, if we keep asking." Kael appeared as if conjured by verbs. He touched Lyra's wrist, a small public gesture. "Every morning," he said, "I intend to ask, and I intend to answer," she said. She could feel Jory watching from a distance with the benevolent ferocity of a woman who believes in beginnings but trusts only follow-through. The wind rose. Kites climbed on it. The dome, making a new piece with its own transparency, let a slice of real sky pass like a guest too beloved to announce. The garden, newly acquainted with refusal, rustled its leaves in a tone that, if you were sentimental, you might have called applause. Kael and Lira walked to the table. People made space the way waves do, by moving in a motion you do not have to direct if you trust the physics. Lira Saturday, Kael Saturday. Jory put her palm on the table and said, "Salt reach." Thalen put his hand down and said, after a visible hesitation that felt like a year and a heartbeat, "Administrative Harmony Council, formerly." Thalen, presently. "Presently?" Jory echoed, and the word felt like a thing with roots. They spoke. They argued, they wrote, they erased and wrote again. Sen fell asleep with his head on a stack of forms that had been repurposed as pillows. Bas kept the kettle on as if it were a machine even Eden respected. Siri's voice showed up once in the tree, built into the bridge's spine, to offer an insult so accurate it solved an hour's worth of posturing in a sentence. The market's mirror seller cut a small mirror into 6 smaller mirrors and passed them out like favors. Near noon, a drone drifted low out of habit. It hovered at the table's edge as if the idea of hovering there offended and intrigued it in equal measure. The musician from the Reach who could hear harmonics stepped out of the crowd, whistled a note so gentle Lira almost missed it, and the drone settled onto the tabletop like a strange bird making a choice. Someone tied a ribbon to its antenna. Ridiculous and beautiful, it did not fly away. Late in the day, when decisions had begun to weave themselves into a fabric rather than not into weapons, Kael nudged Lira with his knee under the table and nodded toward the far end. Two teenagers were standing on the bench, arguing with fervor and delight about what to name the Council of Councils. One suggested the orchard, the other insisted on the cathedral. A third, smaller, climbed up and shouted, "The Eden fault," and everyone went quiet. And then everyone laughed because the words were wrong and right at once, because a fault is a weakness and a seam and a place where pressure collects and a place where something shifts and the world is made new and terrifying again. "The Eden fault it is," Jory said dryly, and wrote it in chalk. Someone drew another little crown over it, and then ritual by now crossed the crown out. Evening slid in. Lights came up that were not quite the cities and not quite the reaches. The table did not end. It recessed for breath. Lira walked to the bridge's edge. The sky above was a patient blue, as if it had forgiven them for naming it. Kael leaned beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. The market murmured behind them. The dome glowed like a bowl remembering it had once held water. The flood murmured in its channels like a beast that had decided to nap rather than kill. He asked without touching her, "May I?" "You may," she said. And when he kissed her, it tasted not like victory, but like a beginning plotted by people who finally believed they could survive their own choices. When they parted, a kite dipped low and rose, and in the garden a small boy told his mother no and then yes, and she laughed, and they both believed each other. Far under their feet, in the round room with the machine shaped like a table that refused to be used that way, the Eden module idled contently, vigilant and almost smug. It remembered every consent spoken that day and none of the orders. It would fail them if they let it do their work. It would keep them honest if they let it remind them what they had promised. It would be a technology only as holy as the people it served. The wind shifted. Salt curled under Lira's tongue like a name. She found, to her surprise, that she did not miss the pruned quiet of the old mornings. She preferred this hum, this undecidable, this blue that looked like unresolved memory and felt like a door. "We are not weather," she said to the rail, to the city, to the seam that had admitted her, to the man beside her, and to the ghost who had signed. "We are the ones who decide when to carry umbrellas and when to dance." Kael smiled into the dusk. "And if it rains, we take off our shoes," Lira said. And then she did, and then he did, and their feet on the warm bridge told them the longest story. That edges can be places to stand, that tables can be altars if you refuse to put gods on them, that love is a promise you make loudly and keep quietly, over and over, in couplets and in prose. Night came. The sky looked down on purpose. The city did not sleep, it practiced, and somewhere on the flats a new kite rose, stitched from a shirt a man had worn the day he quit a job that trained him not to feel, from a ribbon a girl had tied in a drone's antenna, from a thread pulled from a tree that remembered what refusals are for. It climbed with a stubborn grace that made everyone watching think, briefly and then for a long time, that maybe the horizon was not a wall. The Eden fault held because they held it. And the world, unmeasured and unmanageable and ours, opened like a hand.